imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole? Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
And now, welcome to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Here's your host from federaljack.com. It's Popeye.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. On tonight's edition, we are going to be going back in time through a history lesson. We're going to be going back through the time period of the Vietnam War and the Kennedy assassination. Again, because this is the time period of the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy. What better of a time, because everybody's focusing on that time period right now, to bring this information to light again and show people that it's out there. Now, what information am I talking about? What I'm talking about is Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty did an interview back in the 90s. Now, Leno Sanix got it up on Proudy.org. You can go over to that website and purchase all of the interviews that Colonel Prouty's ever done, and I suggest you do. You can get them on DVD. But for you all tonight, I'm going to be playing the audio of an interview that Prouty did back in the 90s, talking about the Bay of Pigs invasion, what really happened, the story that nobody knows, because the history books have it wrong. He'll explain about that too, why the history books have it wrong. He would know better than anybody because he worked under President Kennedy in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he actually was an insider. He has a point of view that nobody else could have. And he gives us accurate information, and he backs up what he says. Again, you need to go read Colonel Prouty's two books, The Secret Team and JFK. The Secret Team and JFK. And the JFK one actually has a bit of a subtitle to it, but it's extremely long. So just look up Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, The Secret Team, and JFK. In fact, if you go to Proudy.org, you can get both books there. And I know actually if you go to Black Op Radio, Leno Sanix's website, he's got a product page you can where you can click on the books there, and you can purchase them. I think it takes you to Amazon, or just go to Amazon.com and look up Prouty or Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty or The Secret Team or JFK, and his books, both of them should come up. And there's also another book you should get. It's kind of like a compendium to his work, and it talks a lot about this stuff. It's an interview that he did with David Ratcliffe, and it's called Understanding Special Operations. What they did was they took the interview and they put it into a book format and published it. And there's only a certain amount of them. Again, if you go to Len's website, blackopradio.com, there's a link there where you can get the book for the price that the author has it out there for, which is like $15 or $20. If you go to Amazon, you'll see people on Amazon selling it or eBay selling it for like ridiculous prices when you can just get it right from the author. There's a limited amount, that's why, but you can get it right from the author. I did. Understanding Special Operations by David Ratcliffe. It was an interview with Colonel Fletcher Prouty that he turned into a book. This man's insight is invaluable, ladies and gentlemen. That's why it's important for you to hear it. And you're going to hear it tonight here. I'm going to play it for you. But first, I want to play something. I want to set it up with something. I want to set the tone. We're going to go back in time, and I have to set the tone, right, the mood. How am I going to do that? I'm going to play for you something that Colonel Prouty mentions in the interview, and this is of extreme importance to understand what was going on in that time period. I'm going to play for you President Eisenhower's farewell address. Listen to the words carefully. Listen very carefully. I'm going to play the full address for you. You're going to hear his full farewell address, and then the rest of the broadcast, I'm going to play this interview that Prouty did. It helps to understand the full aspect of the Kennedy assassination and the forces at work by having an understanding of what was going on in the background and in the bigger picture. And that helps you understand who could have taken out the president, who would have benefited from killing a sitting president, and who would have benefited by pushing along the cover-up after his murder. So to start off, let's go back in time to January 17th, 1961, and listen to what President Eisenhower had to say.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. First, I should like to express my gratitude to the radio and television networks for the opportunities they have given me over the years to bring reports and messages to our nation. My special thanks go to them for the opportunity of addressing you this evening. 3 days from now, after half a century in the service of our country, I shall lay down the responsibilities of office as, in traditional and solemn ceremony, the authority of the presidency is vested in my successor. This evening I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. Like every other citizen, I wish the new president and all who will labor with him Godspeed. I pray that the coming years will be blessed with peace and prosperity for all. Our people expect their president and the Congress to find essential agreement on issues of great moment, the wise resolution of which will better shape the future of the nation. My own relations with the Congress, which began on a remote and tenuous basis when, long ago, a member of the Senate appointed me to West Point, have since ranged to the intimate during the war and immediate post-war period, and finally to the mutually interdependent during these past 8 years. In this final relationship, the Congress and the administration have, on most vital issues, cooperated well to serve the nation good rather than mere partisanship, and so have assured that the business of the nation should go forward. So my official relationship with the Congress ends in a feeling, on my part, of gratitude that we have been able to do so much together. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. 3 of these involved our own country. Despite these holocausts, America is today the strongest, the most influential, and most productive nation in the world. Understandably proud of this preeminence, we yet realize that America's leadership and prestige depend not merely upon our unmatched material progress, riches, and military strength, but on how we use our power in the interest of world peace and human betterment. Throughout America's adventure in free government, our basic purposes have been to keep the peace, to foster progress in human achievement, and to enhance liberty, dignity, and integrity among peoples and among nations. To strive for less would be unworthy of a free and religious people. Any failure traceable to arrogance or our lack of comprehension or readiness to sacrifice would inflict upon us grievous hurt, both at home and abroad. Progress toward these noble goals is persistently threatened by the conflict now engulfing the world. It commands our whole attention, absorbs our very beings. We face a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method. Unhappily, the danger it poses promises to be of indefinite duration. To meet it successfully, there is call for not so much the emotional and transitory sacrifices of crisis, but rather those which enable us to carry forward steadily, surely, and without complaint, the burdens of a prolonged and complex struggle with liberty the stake. Only thus shall we remain, despite every provocation, on our charted course toward permanent peace and human betterment. Crises there will continue to be. In meeting them, whether foreign or domestic, great or small, there is a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties. A huge increase in newer elements of our defenses, development of unrealistic programs to cure every ill in agriculture, a dramatic expansion in basic and applied research. These and many other possibilities, each possibly promising in itself, may be suggested as the only way to the road we wish to travel. But each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration, the need to maintain balance in and among national programs. Balance between the private and the public economy. Balance between the cost and hoped-for advantages. Balance between the clearly necessary and the comfortably desirable. Balance between our essential requirements as a nation and the duties imposed by the nation upon the individual. Balance between actions of the moment and the national welfare of the future. Good judgment seeks balance in progress. Lack of it eventually finds imbalance and frustration. The record of many decades stands as proof that our people and their government have, in the main, understood these truths and have responded to them well in the face of threat and stress. But threats, new in kind or degree, constantly arise. Of these I mention two only. A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military posture has been the technological revolution during recent decades. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor, tinkering in his shop, has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society. Another factor in maintaining balance involves the element of time. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow. During the long lane of the history yet to be written, America knows that this world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate, and be instead a proud confederation of mutual trust and respect. Such a confederation must be one of equals. The weakest must come to the conference table with the same confidence as do we, protected as we are by our moral, economic, and military strength. That table, though scarred by many frustrations, cannot be abandoned for the certainty agony of the battlefield. Disarmament with mutual honor and confidence is a continuing imperative. Together we must learn how to compose differences not with arms, but with intellect and decent purpose. Because this need is so sharp and apparent, I confess that I lay down my official responsibilities in this field with a definite sense of disappointment. As one who has witnessed the horror and the lingering sadness of war, as one who knows that another war could utterly destroy this civilization which has been so slowly and painfully built over thousands of years, I wish I could say tonight that a lasting peace is in sight. Happily, I can say that war has been avoided. Steady progress toward our ultimate goal has been made. but so much remains to be done. As a private citizen, I shall never cease to do what little I can to help the world advance along that road. So in this, my last good night to you as your president, I thank you for the many opportunities you have given me for public service in war and in peace. I trust in that service, you find some things worthy. As for the rest of it, I know you will find ways to improve performance in the future. You and I, my fellow citizens, need to be strong in our faith that all nations under God will reach the goal of peace with justice. May we be ever unswerving in devotion to principle, confident but humble with power, diligent in pursuit of the nation's great goals. To all the peoples of the world, I once more give expression to America's prayerful and continuing aspiration. We pray that peoples of all faiths, all races, all nations may have their great human needs satisfied, that those now denied opportunity shall come to enjoy it to the full, that all who yearn for freedom may experience its spiritual blessings. Those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibility, that all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, and that the scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made disappear from the earth, and that in the goodness of time all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed by the binding force of mutual respect and love. Now, on Friday noon, I am to become a private citizen. I am proud to do so. I look forward to it. Thank you, and good night.
Well, it turns out President Eisenhower was right. The military-industrial complex is one of the biggest threats to this nation's security. Hands down. The wars that we've been involved in since have not benefited anyone but the bankers, the military-industrial complex, and the select few at the very top who have an overall agenda that they'd rather lie to you about and tell you that doesn't exist. Pretend it's not real. Call you a conspiracy theorist for discussing it. Make fun of you. Get your peers to make fun of you. That's the only way they can actually handle any of this. They can never actually discuss this stuff, you notice? They can never debate it. You know why they can't debate it or discuss it? Because they'd lose. If they had a logical debate about any of this, and they were actually forced to admit to things and face facts, well, they'd lose. And they'd lose on a grand scale. So the only way to win is to lie, manipulate, cheat, steal, subjugate. That's the only way that they can keep their power. These powers that shouldn't be. So, I think President Eisenhower was right. It's a shame that the general populace didn't pay more attention to him. The country was kind of young at the time still in its infancy. Of course, after Kennedy's murder, country got a little bit older. It was like going through puberty, or as Beverly Oliver described it, losing her virginity all over again. That's the day that she lost her virginity, she says, was November 22nd, 1963. And that's the day that this country lost its virginity too. This country was more innocent. People trusted more. It might have been easier to get away with the term conspiracy theorist beforehand as a pejorative label, although it wasn't really thrown around as a pejorative label the way it is now until after the assassination of President Kennedy. Thanks, Langley. This is true history, ladies and gentlemen, stuff that you are just not told about. Things that are kept from you. The truth is right there. It's right in front of your face. You just need to look for it. You need to realize what you're looking at. That's part of the problem. You filter it out and you don't even realize it. We all do it. Because we've been programmed to. That's the power of their mind control programming. Anyway, we have about a minute for the break sneaks up on us, ladies and gentlemen. On the other side, when we come back, I will play the interview with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty about the Bay of Pigs, the Pentagon Papers, JFK's assassination, and the Vietnam War. Very powerful audio. It is important for you all to hear this, to have a full understanding of what was going on in the 1960s during the Kennedy administration, and before it, and after he was killed, and then into Vietnam. Colonel Prouty is a huge piece of history. His information needs to be heard. You're going to hear it on the other side of the break. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. We'll be back in a few short minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back from break. Let's get right into it, because we don't have much time, and I want to get the entire interview aired for you, so you have the full context and a full understanding of the information, so you can then make a better judgment as to whether you think President Kennedy was killed as part of a conspiracy. And if you think so, then, because it is obviously the truth, then you can go back and look further into history and to what was going on to understand who would have benefited and perhaps who could be the people that were involved, because that seems to be the biggest question, is when people say, well, who did it, who was involved, right? So that's what this little history lesson is about. It gives us a little bit of background information and lets you understand who could possibly benefit from killing the president. So let's get right into it. Here's Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty on the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Pentagon Papers.
We're here today on August 5th, 1993, with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, Air Force retired, to discuss various incidents in history that were so formative in post-World War II U.S. history, politics, power, and to look at things in more detail than is commonly done throughout the media in this day and age. One thing that I've always felt you provide a great deal of solid information on that is never discussed is the whole formative event of the Kennedy administration, which is the Bay of Pigs. And citing the letter to the president that was written by the four people that he convened to study what went wrong with the Bay of Pigs. There's a great deal in that committee, the testimony that they heard from people, the way they operated, that is never talked about, that is crucial, it seems, to understanding how Kennedy got his sea legs, so to speak, when he became president, in seeing how things weren't working right with the failure of this operation. Mm-hmm. I'd like to have you tell us some about, perhaps start with this final report that was never found for years because people were asking the wrong questions, that indicates the perceptiveness of the president in trying to understand what had really happened so that it wouldn't happen again.
You know, it's an awfully good approach to the problem, because very few people have studied the Kennedy period before his death, or even have known much about Kennedy before he was elected president. You know, he came right out of World War II with a busy career during the war as a naval officer. He was elected congressman from Massachusetts, served as a congressman. He stayed here in Washington, served as a senator from Massachusetts, and then was elected president. There are very few men arriving at the office of president who had more background in Washington than Kennedy had. He was younger than most of them, but he had more background experience, which means he knew the bad things as well as the good things. There were a lot of things that he was against in the way the government had been going under the Eisenhower and post-war administration, and he wanted to use the presidential power to change them. And one of the first things that he found that he had to take care of, there were two things, was the Bay of Pigs. Now, that was an Eisenhower program. That was approved by the Eisenhower National Security Council in March of 1960. About May of 1960, the CIA people came to my office because it was my job in the Pentagon to provide the support of CIA's clandestine operations. That was my job. I had been in the job for years. And they wanted to have the military open a base where they could train these exile Cubans who were perfectly willing to try to get back into Cuba and incite enough rebellion to throw Castro out, because that's what the original Eisenhower approval was, to try to get proven Cuban support for the plan. Eisenhower would never have approved an invasion. He never did. Eisenhower knew too much about invasions to have that happen. Well, you follow that through now from the mid-60s, and then you have this important event when Kennedy and Nixon had the TV debates just before the election. And everybody felt that the two were just inseparable. There was no way to tell who was going to be elected president. And they came to debate number 4, and Kennedy pressed the Cuban issue, the Castro issue, because Nixon had made so much of it, you know, that the government, we would overthrow Castro, we're going to get rid of Castro, he's a communist and all that sort of thing. And Kennedy, who knew as much or more about the program than even Nixon did, whipped Nixon in the debate. And let me tell you just a little personal incident as a part of my official duties, but it lets you see the validity of this. I was asked to go to the Senate office building to a certain room number and to pick up 4 men and bring them back to the office of the Secretary of Defense. That's where I was working. I was working with the Office of Secretary of Defense. The 4 men I picked up were the leaders of the Cuban program, Artima and Mendonca and De Verona and those people. And they knew Kennedy. They were in the office room I was sent to was Kennedy's office. So here's Kennedy with these Cubans talking with them in August of 1960. He had just won the Democratic nomination to run for president. He knew this background. And furthermore, I understand that the Cubans had visited him in his home in Palm Beach. He knew these people. He knew everything that was going on. Well, Nixon didn't know he knew that. So in the debate, when it came time to argue with Nixon about it, Kennedy cleaned up on that debate, and a lot of people believe that's how he won the election, a very narrow election, but he won. Days after that debate, the CIA came to us in the Pentagon talking about an invasion of Cuba. That was not the approved plan. Kennedy was not president yet. We knew Eisenhower wouldn't talk about that. The CIA did it. They put pressure on Kennedy themselves. And what had been a plan to drop 30-man groups from an airplane, a C-46 can carry about 30 with their equipment, or over-the-beach program from submarines or fast boats, 20 or 30 men, all of a sudden they're talking about 3,000 men, training the 3,000. I had to send men to Guatemala to train pilots. I had to get aircraft reconfigured in Arizona to be used for that purpose. We got Filipino experienced men that General Lansdale knew that had helped him during the time when he was in the overthrow of Quirino in the Philippines, which is much like the Castro thing. So the Filipino experience was valuable. People don't realize how big the Cuban program was. The ships had arms and equipment on board enough for 25,000 fighters. Not just the 1,500 that went on the beach. You see, all of this developed in the working arrangements that were being made from day to day to support this operation. But the strange thing was how it accelerated right after the election. They were going to press Kennedy to accept the invasion because during the time before his inaugural, They got all of this change started and in being. So that by the time of the invasion, actually the ships were at sea from different areas already heading for Cuba, and Kennedy had not approved the program. So you see, that is so different from what most people have heard about the way the thing was organized. One thing that the agency had done at the suggestion of the JCS was to bring in a most competent Marine colonel who knew invasion tactics to work out the invasion plan. The JCS had told the CIA that if Castro's combat aircraft were not destroyed before the men hit the beach, there was no chance that they could get on, because the combat aircraft were being on home ground and all, and the men just on the beach with no protection couldn't protect themselves. They must destroy the aircraft totally before the men hit the beach. That was a fundament of the whole plan. And the Marine colonel knew it, and the JCS had told the CIA that. Well, it finally came down to where, after several meetings with the president, during which he would not approve the program, finally, in the middle of April of 1961, Mr. Dulles told him that, well, we have got to do something. We've been training these men now for a year. They think they're going to be brought into their home, and they think we're going to help them gain their country back again. And incidentally, the ships with the men on board are at sea, rendezvousing around the Vieques Island area. We must get an approval to go. Is there anything else to keep it from on? Kennedy waited for the strike on the airfields of Cuba until Saturday morning. They destroyed 7 of Castro's 10 combat-capable aircraft. They didn't have to bother with the transports and all. They went after the bombers and the fighters. They destroyed 7 of them. Unfortunately, 3 jets had taken off from where they had been the day before, when we had pictures of them, and gone down to Santiago for the weekend, and they weren't there and they weren't destroyed. So on Sunday, when they went to brief the president, they told him, they showed him pictures, they had destroyed 7 planes, but 3 were left. They had to get those 3 airplanes before the men hit the beach at Zapata Landing. Well, Kennedy ordered specifically, sometime about mid-afternoon, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he ordered the first thing to be the destruction of those aircraft. That was a Kennedy order. A very close friend of mine was in command of the bomber base in Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua, that was to do the job. 4 B-26s were to be dispatched about 1 o'clock, and it's very important because they had to hit the planes before the dawn landing of the men on the beach, or the landing would they'd be in the air supporting the beach, and they were so superior to the bombers that they shoot the bombers down one after the other. Everybody understood that, we thought. So Kennedy ordered that, and as a prerequisite to the landing. He agreed to the landing on Monday morning, April 18th, 1961. Now, when there was a study of what happened, Kennedy put together the Cuban study group to find out what went wrong. Here is an old mimeographed copy from my days in the Pentagon of the report of this study group. It wasn't seen by anyone, or very few people, for at least 20 years, when it began to pop up in books that people knew about it. And then finally, in 1981, this book was published for academic purposes, for university use, a book called Zapata, which is every word that's in here, just an absolute copy of this. But this is the old original. I want you to see what it looked like in the beginning. And when the Cuban study group questioned the people that came before as to what happened and why didn't we succeed with the Bay of Pigs program, they ran into a most interesting situation because, first of all, Kennedy and his advisors were very adept at this organization. They really did a good job. Can you imagine a committee better than this one to study the Bay of Pigs? Allen Dulles was on that study group. Admiral Burke was on the study group. Admiral Burke was a CNO of the Navy, member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was the one who had been designated to support the operation of the Bay of Pigs landings. Now, he knew more about it than anybody else. He was sitting in the room, no matter who came in. Admiral Burke, old Arleigh Burke, knew what was going on, and I've talked to him many times since then about this, and he did know. Another man was General Maxwell Taylor. Maxwell Taylor and Kennedy had never met, but Kennedy knew Maxwell Taylor's reputation, and he knew that he was a good, solid man for this kind of investigation. So he put Maxwell Taylor as the chairman of the group. But there was a fourth man, and as my friends would tell me when they'd come back from the hearing, I knew almost all the guys that went in there. My office was only about 2 doors down from where the committee was meeting in the Pentagon. They'd come back and they'd say, you know, those 3 guys are pretty tough, but it's that little son of a gun on that straight back chair in the corner that's really watching it with beady eye, doesn't say anything. Well, that's Bobby Kennedy. Can you imagine? Bobby Kennedy, Maxwell Taylor, Arleigh Burke, and Allen Dulles to study what went wrong with the Bay of Pigs. Now, they were even sharper than that, because by that time, Maxwell Taylor and my boss, General Lemitzer, and Arleigh Burke had made up their mind that this was the last time that the CIA was going to get into a major operation. They weren't the right people to be running military-type operations. So they brought in other competent people to provide them with information that they would provide to Kennedy in this report. And one of the best things they did, one of the people they brought in that was really important, was General Walter Beadle Smith. Now, people who remember World War II will remember that he was the chief of staff for Eisenhower for the invasion of Europe and the whole European operation in World War II. A very competent, experienced, reliable general. And immediately at the end of World War II, Walter Beadle Smith had been sent to Moscow as the American ambassador to the Soviet Union. Well, of course, they were our partners through the war. It was a very friendly relationship. Smith was highly regarded by the Soviets as a general that had helped them defeat Hitler and his German troops. So it was a great assignment for Smith. He learned a hell of a lot from that. And so what did he do? From Moscow, he was assigned to the new Central Intelligence Agency. And he became the director of Central Intelligence. A lot of people don't remember that.
Under Truman.
Under Truman, yes. And as the director of Central Intelligence, all the CIA people knew him very well. They knew that he knew things, they knew he was tough, and that they couldn't get around him. So what did they do in the Zapata program? They bring General Smith in. He didn't have anything to do with the Cuban program, but he was pretty useful because, among other things, and this probably tips Kennedy's hand as close as anything I can think of in trying to study what happened. Why was Kennedy killed? What brought up the pressures and the power and the intense feelings against Kennedy that would cause people in power to make the decision to get rid of him? But it begins with this sort of a thing. In response to questions about running something like the Bay of Pigs, Smith said clearly, a democracy cannot wage war. When you go to war, you pass a law giving extraordinary powers to the president. The people of our country assume, when the emergency is over, that the rights and the powers that were temporarily delegated to the chief executive will be returned to the states, to the counties, to the people. Pretty fundamental statement from a major, not I mean a full general, but from a major general, an important man.
Right.
He went on to say now about Bay of Pigs, I only know what the papers say, but covert operations, and he knew a lot about them, he'd been to DCI, can be done up to a certain size.
Right.
And we've handled some pretty large operations. By that he meant, if it's not more than 2 or 3 people, it can't be a secret anymore. In fact, the New York Times had carried front-page headlines saying the U.S. government was supporting the exiles against Castro in March of 1961. It was already all over the papers. He's pointing that out as a mistake. But then Smith begins to get to the point. He said, I think that so much publicity has been given to CIA that the covert work might have to be put under another roof. And he was pretty explicit about that. He'd say, it's time we take the bucket of slop and go out and cover over it. Well, what something like that does is put in the president's mind the words from a man that knew everything there was, and from the time he heard that from Walter Beetle Smith by way of his Cuban Study Group committee, you know he had one thing in his mind: he's going to get through with the CIA in that kind of business. And let me just read you what General Taylor presented to the general when that was over. When the Cuban Study Group had completed its work,
Right.
they had agreed unanimously with their own report. Even though Dulles was on there, it was a unanimous vote. Even though Bobby Kennedy was on it, it was a unanimous vote. It ended up as a letter to the President on the 13th of June, 1961. Their work was done very quickly. And one of the dominant things to come out of it was a paper that President Kennedy signed personally and sent directly to General Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He didn't send it to the State Department, to Dean Rusk. He didn't even send it to McNamara, which all correspondents ordinarily would go through, and he didn't send a copy to CIA. So you can see that Kennedy was saying to General Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this is what I want done. Now, in the procedures of how you do these things in the Joint Staff, where everything is very formal, it just happened that I was the officer that the director of the Joint Staff gave this paper to from the White House and said, prepare a briefing for the chiefs. And I did, so I'm very familiar with it. And I'll only read a paragraph, but you don't have to read more. The President informed the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the President regards the Joint Chiefs of Staff as his principal military advisor, responsible both for initiating advice to him and responding to a request for advice. He expects their advice to come to him direct and unfiltered, and that the Joint Chiefs of Staff have a similar responsibility for the defense of the nation in a Cold War as they have in conventional hostilities. Now, in the terminology of the government, to say that the Joint Chiefs of Staff have that responsibility in the Cold War, he's saying the CIA will no longer have that responsibility. You see? That was a stroke of the pen that was as powerful as a thunderclap. And when I read that to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you could have heard a pin drop. And I was told, Colonel Prouty, take that back to the files. When we need it, we'll call you. You know what that meant? They were going to wait until the situation had been completely prepared for this next step forward, because that's a major change.
They understood the implications.
Yes. They realized, how can the military in uniform go into covert operations? I mean, the ridiculous POW MIA situation that we have now is a result of that. 15 years of the Vietnam War, everybody that went to Vietnam was under the command, operational control of a CIA man. Well, then how can he be a prisoner of war? He's a spy. And that's what the enemy thought. They didn't give a darn about all the fine print. Right. So you see, the Chiefs of Staff knew that. So for the next few years, Kennedy studied this situation and prepared the ground for a report. But this is why I feel that the key, the beginning point in the troubles that Kennedy had with many points of power began with this situation, because he signaled clearly, with the assistance of General Smith and the others, that he was putting the CIA out of this business and turning them back to intelligence only. And of course, the law that created CIA never gave him this authority in the first place. So he was right, and he knew that law. That's why I say the Bay of Pigs is the key to the problems that came later.
One other thing in that is the question of the miscommunications, apparently, that occurred come Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening, that seems to have centered around McGeorge Bundy, his
Yes.
special assistant.
There is a common misunderstanding about that business. Among the people called before this Cuban study group, the 4 men that I mentioned to you, was the advisor to the president, Mr. McGeorge Bundy. And he, I believe, visited them 3 times, and they also accepted written material from him. It was a pretty thorough contact between the committee and Mr. Bundy. And then in their conclusions, which anybody can read, they pointed out that it was their opinion that the most significant reason for the failure of the Bay of Pigs was the fact that this airstrike that Kennedy had ordered on that Sunday afternoon, the day before the landing, was canceled. And in pursuing how that happened, they found out that at 9:30 on Sunday night, McGeorge Bundy had called General Cabell, who was responsible for the CIA at that time, because of all weekends, Allen Dulles was out of the country. Here he's in charge of the whole thing, and Allen Dulles was out of the country. But anyway, General Cabell, perfectly competent person, was called by McGeorge Bundy and told not to fly the airplanes that night until they could operate them the next day off the beach at the Zapata landing site, which destroyed the whole operation. If McGeorge Bundy had had a little more military experience, perhaps, or if General Cabell had had just a little more, thought about it more, they'd have realized that they absolutely destroyed the Bay of Pigs there, because if they didn't destroy those last 3 aircraft, they were going to lose. And those 3 aircraft, the first thing in the morning, sank the 2 supply ships, so that the men on the beach had no ammunition, their food was gone, their radios were gone, their trucks were gone, everything. Just those little airplanes did it.
I'm going to pause it right there, ladies and gentlemen, because the top of the hour break is sneaking up on us. Hour 1 is up, but hour number 2 is coming up. When we get back, I will pick it up with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty on the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Pentagon Papers. And I'm going to rewind it, obviously, a few minutes, because anybody just joining us in hour 2, if I pick it up right in mid-sentence where he left off, where he was talking about the Bay of Pigs invasion itself, people might get lost. So I'm going to rewind it a few minutes to pick it up in full context. You're not going to miss anything at all, I promise. You're going to hear the full interview with Colonel Prouty, so stay tuned. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to hour number 2 here on tonight's edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I am your host, Popeye, from FederalJack.com. Tonight, in case you're just tuning in hour 1, I played President Eisenhower's farewell address, where he warned us about the military-industrial complex to set the tone for this evening's broadcast. And then I proceeded to play an interview with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, done back in the 90s, where he's talking about the Pentagon Papers and the Vietnam War and the Bay of Pigs invasion and what was going on around that time period. To give everybody a bit of a background as to what was going on, more than just talking about the Kennedy assassination itself, you have to understand what was also going on in the background and around the atmosphere of the time, to understand what could make the air ripe for his assassination by a conspiracy and not by a lone nut gunman who was just pissed at him for whatever reason that they'd like to throw at Lee Harvey Oswald, or he did it for fame, or whatever excuse that they try to come up with to push their official story, which just keeps falling apart when you research it and you do the slightest bit of looking into this. Anyway, I digress. Let's get back into it. If you didn't hear hour 1, go pick it up in the archives. Let's get back into it. Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty on the Pentagon Papers, the Vietnam War, and the Bay of Pigs invasion.
The most significant reason for the failure of the Bay of Pigs was the fact that this airstrike that Kennedy had ordered on that Sunday afternoon, the day before the landing, was canceled. And in pursuing how that happened, they found out that at 9:30 on Sunday night, McGeorge Bundy had called General Cabell, who was responsible for the CIA at that time, because of all weekends, Allen Dulles was out of the country. Here he's in charge of the whole thing, and Allen Dulles was out of the country. But anyway, General Cabell, perfectly competent person, was called by McGeorge Bundy and told not to fly the airplanes that night until they could operate them the next day off the beach at the Zapata landing site, which destroyed the whole operation. If George Bundy had had a little more military experience, perhaps, or if General Cabell had had just a little more, thought about it more, they'd have realized that they absolutely destroyed the Bay of Pigs there, because if they didn't destroy those last 3 aircraft, they were going to lose. And those 3 aircraft, the first thing in the morning, sank the 2 supply ships, so that the men on the beach had no ammunition, their food was gone, their radios were gone, their trucks were gone, everything. Just those little airplanes did it. And during the period that the men were on the beach, they destroyed 16 B-26s. In other words, just raised havoc with the whole operation. So it's obvious the study group, when Maxwell Taylor wrote his letter to the president, he said, our conclusion is that the principal reason for the failure was the failure to carry out the mission that the president had ordered to destroy those last 3 planes.
Why did Bundy give that call?
There have been a lot of collateral points. The paper I've read to you does not elaborate on why he did it. But with Bobby Kennedy in the room, you know very well that Bundy couldn't say such other things as, oh, the president told me to do it, because Bobby would have known that wasn't true.
Right.
So he couldn't say that. And perhaps Bundy's inexperience in military matters, I don't know, I couldn't make an excuse. All I know is he called Cabell and said, don't fly it. And that's on the record. I don't say that. I read it from the record.
Because there's that other place that we put the yellow post-it in there that was the actual base conclusion of their sense of why it had failed, which is never talked about. This is never articulated anywhere in newspapers or anything if the Bay of Pigs is ever discussed.
You know, that's a problem too, because there are many books written about the Bay of Pigs, and some of them were written after 1981 when Zapata had been released. Up to that time, this kind of thing was not available. I had it, but I don't know anybody else that had it. But so that they have never quoted the exact words. And to be sure that we understand exactly what the study group found, I will read you the words that they sent to the president. It's item 43 in their report, and it simply says, at about 9:30 p.m. on 16 April, that was that Sunday when Kennedy directed the attack, Mr. McGeorge Bundy, Special Assistant to the President, telephoned General C.P. Cabell, who was the Deputy Director of CIA and had a long time experience with CIA, to inform him that the dawn airstrikes the following morning should not be launched until they could be conducted from a strip within the beachhead. Now, you see, there was a strip within the beachhead, but you can't destroy the airplanes after they've already destroyed your landing. I mean, it's backwards.
Right.
And this hit the committee. I mean, this is the thing they said, this is our finding as to the basic reason for the failure of the Bay of Pigs. And when they interviewed Cubans down through here in the back, when they talked to these poor Cubans that were involved, each of the Cubans, one after the other, says, the problem was we didn't have the aircraft to destroy those last 3.
Right.
And of course, certain propagandists, or whatever you want, revisionists, want to say that the problem was that Kennedy denied the air cover.
Right.
There was no air cover in the plan, because the plan was written and approved by the JCS to destroy all of Castro's aircraft first.
Right.
You don't need air cover if they have no planes. See, the plan was built on that idea. And people say that he should have provided the air cover. There is a National Security Council directive, which is a superior document to everything we have in the Executive Department, that was produced and signed in Eisenhower's time in March of 1954. It's been in effect for a long time, called NSC Directive number 5412. And that directive prohibits the use of uniformed services in covert operations, prohibits it. Our government knew that during Eisenhower's time, and of course Kennedy knew that during his time. That precluded the use of military in a clandestine operation. And that's the kind of thing that General Smith was referring to. You can't mix the two. You can't put the military in covert operations. And we're having trouble with that today. Is our operation in Somalia, is that considered maybe a covert operation, or is it a military operation? How are we running? Are the people that are flying the airplanes considered military, or are they considered some kind? We don't have a place in the middle of those. This is what the government's trying to work out at the present time. What is the role of the military? Even in the Vietnam War for 15 years, the military that were used before 1965, and you know it started in 1945, the first American was killed in Vietnam in September 45. For those 20 years, all activity was covert. It was under the CIA. So that's what we're going back to the program here. And Kennedy knew that it was against the government policy to use military active duty air crews in such a landing as a covert operation, because it immediately would reveal the hand of the U.S. government in an operation against a sovereign country, and that's not permitted. So the people that throw the idea of Kennedy's failure to provide air cover are just unaware of the situation that existed legally, in practice, and in the way you use military in this country. We agree with those laws and international agreements, and we don't do it the other way.
The Bay of Pigs and the Vietnam War were covert operations.
You see, that's a good way to link the two together, because historically these two things ran together. They were essentially the same thing. They were major CIA operations that the generals knew were too big to even be thought of as covert operations. You know, the CIA assisted a rebellion in Indonesia in 1958, in which at one time I myself ordered the delivery of 42,000 rifles. I mean, that's not a covert operation, you see. We were using submarines against the south coast of the islands of Indonesia, not a covert operation. So the military looked very carefully at these things and knew that the CIA was going much too far. We supported the Khamba people in Tibet, something like 60 or 70,000 of them, by dropping arms to them, medicine, weapons, everything. To those people. That's not covert, but we thought it was. You know, we put it under the rules of CIA's operation. And this is what Kennedy was facing during that transition from the Eisenhower time, when the CIA had begun to get into all these things. The Indonesian rebellion, the Tibetan program, the Cuban program, all were in that period of time, and Kennedy inherited that. And at the same time, the General Ridgway, who died just a week or two ago, told Kennedy clearly, don't ever let Americans come into Asia. Don't ever bring American soldiers into Asia. And General Bradley, I used to be General Bradley's personal pilot, and I know the gentleman, one of the finest men ever put a uniform on. He gave Kennedy the same answers. Eisenhower, in this book here on the foreign relations of the United States, says how bitterly he opposes the entry of American divisions into Vietnam. If I've tabbed that page, it's very interesting. This, by the way, is the foreign relations of the United States, Vietnam, August to December 1963, zeroing right in on the peak of the time of Kennedy's involvement in the planning for the future in Vietnam. And anybody that wants to think that Kennedy was not deep into the activities in Vietnam doesn't realize that during this period of that time, there were meetings going on day after day after day in the White House, in which my own boss, General Victor Krulak, was involved, Maxwell Taylor was involved, McNamara was involved, and what that would mean is when they'd come back to the office, the rest of us in the Joint Staff were involved, supporting the President in the development of these plans. because he knew that he was either going to have to make the decision, as he did in NSAM 55,
Right.
to get the CIA out of this covert work, and with the CIA out of, say, the operation in Vietnam, he saw no role for the military. And it was perfectly logical from the Kennedy point of view and from what the Joint Chiefs of Staff had told him that we should not be in Vietnam. And when he wrote this document, which, because of our movie JFK, Oliver Stone's work, where we introduced the subject of the National Security Action Memorandum number 263,
Right.
which was written and signed on October 11th, 1963, saying that that all U.S., all American personnel would be out of Vietnam by the end of 65. That was Kennedy's decision after all of this work spanning this period of 6 months. And here you can read day by day by day the meetings were, well, I counted over 50 meetings that are listed in this book in which my own boss, General Krulak, attending meetings with President Kennedy on Vietnam. And as Kennedy worked his Vietnam policy out during that period, he arrived at what you might call a scenario. He wanted to be sure everybody understood what he was doing. So he sent General Krulak quickly to Vietnam. The idea being, published in the papers, that he was going to get the last-minute word in Vietnam to see how things stood.
That was in late August, or?
Late August. I think he actually traveled in September,
Okay.
because I myself was sent to the SINCPAC headquarters in Hawaii to meet with Admiral Felt, and I have yet never revealed the reasons for that meeting, but the two had a very strong, I was doing a lot of writing for General Krulak, and they were very much related. And when General Krulak came back, he met with Kennedy and discussed up to date the things he heard from the people out there, which of course we knew by telephone anyway, but it made the scenario more reasonable. And so immediately Kennedy ordered Maxwell Taylor and McNamara to go to Vietnam. And so they went late in September, I believe it is. After a very busy flying trip, going all over the country, talking not only to President Diem, but to his opposition, because by that time Diem had some serious opposition in his country, they came back. Well, they had brought a big trip report for the president. Now, it's absolute fantasy to think that two busy men like General Taylor and Mr. McNamara are going to make a quick flying trip all through Vietnam, traversing the Pacific Ocean and everything, and write a great trip report while they go. It would be written right in the Pentagon. But more importantly, it was being written as a result of these meetings, and Kennedy was dictating the policy daily to these people that he met with. His staff in the White House, people from State Department, people from CIA, and the military. And when McNamara and Taylor got back to Hawaii, a jet carrying the report landed in Hawaii and gave it to him. A big document, big, with leather covered, with President John F. Kennedy on the cover and all that sort of thing. They couldn't possibly have done that while they were traveling. And then they had the time to review the report as they flew back to Washington, usually a 8-hour, 45-minute trip in those days in one of the Air Force One aircraft. And they left Andrews Field in a helicopter. They arrived on the White House lawn and presented it to the president. It had just left him about 2 days earlier. And here was the trip report. That's October 2nd of 1963. And that trip report contains the information that Kennedy had approved, that he was going to bring 1,000 men home by Christmas time. That's 1,000 military men. And by the end of 65, the bulk of U.S. personnel. Now, bureaucracy is an interesting thing. We learn what certain words mean. If he had said he would bring home the bulk of American military personnel, you would assume that the military personnel were there. So he'd bring them in. And most people who write about that period say Kennedy was going to bring home or not bring home. He was going to, they use the word they were going to withdraw the soldiers. Well, you weren't going to withdraw them. They weren't there. Withdrawal is not the word. That's wrong. And many people have been writing for The Nation magazine and other magazines like that trying to explain Kennedy's mind, overlooked the fact that we very carefully inserted into that document, bring home the U.S. personnel. And what did that mean? The CIA people were coming out. So again, that lowered the boom on the CIA, and this time it was the last time. They were going to be out of covert operation completely. So NSAM 55 began the movement of getting CIA out, and 263 closed the book on it, and by 65 he would have had no CIA people in Vietnam at all, and they'd been there since 45. So you see a good long period of time, 20 years. And in other countries too, he would have stopped them from being in covert operations overseas. It's very fundamental points that if you look in the right books and at the right reports, you get them all, and they're all backed up. These are not my words. I happen to be there, and I happen to be working in them. But this series, especially this latest book that has just been released, gives you the answers to what people have been looking for years. But the trouble is that during this period, countless history books have been written about Kennedy, about Vietnam, about the post-war period, about the Cold War. And the writers have not used this sort of material. And unfortunately, the books are, what would we call them, fantasy or mythology?
Concoction.
Incorrect. I belong to the Society of Historians for American Foreign Relations, a wonderful organization of thousands of mostly history professors all throughout the country. And as we have our annual meetings, one of the complaints that arises more frequently than any other is the quality of history books today. Quality meaning, are they true? Are they revisionist? There's more things been written about Kennedy that are absolutely untrue since his death. There's no sense of killing a guy twice, once with a gun and once with a typewriter. And they're untrue. And what I think people ought to do is refer to the work of these generals, like this report at the Bay of Pigs, or refer to these papers from the State Department. They're listed as the Foreign Relations of the United States, and see what the facts are. Or refer to some of the gentlemen that are mentioned in here who are still with us, God bless them, because those are the important things. And that tells us what really happened. And this is why when I worked with Oliver Stone, we were working from this kind of paper, and that's what stirred up so much opposition. Because when these big-time writers in the New York Times and the Washington Post and other papers said, there is no substantive history to back up what Stone's putting in the film, all they do is read these books. There's the substantive history. And it's appalling to think that these men who work every day on the minds of the American public with their computer writing through the New York Times and the Washington Post and the rest of them are telling us that sort of thing when they know very well what they're saying is not true. It's too bad, but it's not true.
And as you were saying before, the Taylor-McNamara report, which became, in essence, the formalized text for 263, you were involved working under Krulak in writing a lot of what became their report that they gave back to Kennedy when they arrived on the White House lawn, that was derived from all these meetings.
Yes. And you know, people have to understand, when you talk about the Joint Chiefs of Staff, there's an organization called the Joint Staff. Now in my day, by law, it could not exceed 400 people. And so I was one of 400. And people say, well, what's your job? Our job is to do this kind of thing. When General Krulak would come back, he'd throw notes on the table before 5 or 6 of us, or even tape record, cassette recording. And he'd say, there's what we did today. Now look, each one of you do such and such a part you've been working on, and we'll get this report the way the President wants it. Right. And when it was the way the President wanted it, that's when it went out to Hawaii to Taylor and McNamara, so that when it came back, the President was ready to sign it as his policy for Vietnam, which was he was not going to put American troops into Vietnam. Where we put, do you know how many troops were really in Vietnam? 2,600,000. And 58,000 were killed, let alone all the other people that were killed.
By the time it was all done?
By the time the Vietnam War was over, 2,600,000 men had been rotated through Vietnam. We don't very often think about that. We dropped more bombs from aircraft in Vietnam, in Indochina, than all of World War II. People don't have any idea what Vietnam really got to be after the death of Kennedy. Well, in all of those big numbers that I'm talking about, the money that rolled out went at least to $570 billion. Now, if Kennedy had not died, he would not have put those people there, not just the 500,000 that were there at any one given day, but the 2,600,000. And if the people didn't go, they would not have had to spend the $570 billion. Well, there were, as General Eisenhower said in his great speech, which was the opening of the Stone film, that beware of the military-industrial complex. And when you threaten such a complex with the potential of 570 billion, and then you're going to bring it down to nothing, you are bound to get some hot-headed decisions. And the removal of the president is not a very difficult thing to do. Just think of the list of presidents who've been wounded, shot at, killed since World War II. A lot of people don't know that even President Carter was threatened with assassination. And President Reagan had a bullet in him. It's a very, very different world when we don't use things in a factual basis and really know what's going on, because then the public is so badly confused. Plus in debt. Confused and deeply in debt. You know, I don't have, my book is here. I don't know whether I can, but in the book I could show you, just to make a point, because I knew the document, I inserted in this book of mine the picture of these men coming back to Washington with this report. It's on the coffee table in the president's office. And if anybody thinks that huge report could have been written while they were running from one place to another in Vietnam, you see that big report on the coffee table in front of the president, and Maxwell Taylor and McNamara there? That is the report of the trip. They couldn't have done that on the back of envelopes while they were running.
Right.
And it was very carefully designed by Kennedy to support his Vietnam policy.
I'm going to pause it right there because we have the break sneaking up on us in a few short seconds. When we come back on the other side, I of course, will pick it up right where we're leaving off. In fact, for continuity purposes, I will rewind it a few minutes so people understand the report that he's talking about and the reality of what that report is and what it became. So stay tuned. I don't want you to go anywhere and miss anything. This is some key information that, again, you can only hear from Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back from break. Final segment. Going to finish the interview with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. Again, go to prouty.org, PROUTY.org, and pick up his books, pick up all of his interviews. Leno Sanek runs the website. He's a host. I've had him on the radio broadcast before. I'm sure you all remember who he is. You'll listen to my archives for those shows. He's a host of Black Op Radio. He runs that website. He also runs blackopradio.com. Go check out prouty.org. It's an archive of everything Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. The Mr. X character in Oliver Stone's JFK is based off of Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. Do your homework, ladies and gentlemen. Again, this information is key. It's very important to know this stuff. So let's get right back into it. I rewound it a few minutes to get the full context because I cut it off in the middle of where Colonel Prouty was talking about Maxwell Taylor and General Krulak being sent out to Vietnam. So I rewound it a few minutes so you get the full context again, because what he says is important to focus on. Again, it shows you who benefited from the Vietnam War, and of course Kennedy would have stopped the Vietnam War, so Kennedy had to go. Very important information that most people have no idea about, ladies and gentlemen. And they don't know, most people don't know the true numbers about the Vietnam War, the true troop numbers. And that's why the amount of deaths were so high, if you understand the amount of troops that were really there. Let's get right back into it, ladies and gentlemen, finishing up with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty on the Bay of Pigs invasion, Vietnam, the Pentagon Papers, and a little bit about JFK. Here we go.
Kennedy ordered Maxwell Taylor and McNamara to go to Vietnam. And so they went late in September, I believe it is. After a very busy flying trip, going all over the country, talking not only to President Diem, but to his opposition, because by that time Diem had some serious opposition in his country, they came back. Well, they had brought a big trip report for the president. Now, it's absolute fantasy to think that two busy men like General Taylor and Mr. McNamara are going to make a quick flying trip all through Vietnam, transversing the Pacific Ocean and everything, and write a great trip report while they go. It would be written right in the Pentagon. But more importantly, it was being written as a result of these meetings, and Kennedy was dictating the policy daily to these people that he met with. His staff in the White House, people from State Department, people from CIA, and the military. And when McNamara and Taylor got back to Hawaii, a jet carrying the report landed in Hawaii and gave it to them. A big document, big, with leather covered, with President John F. Kennedy on the cover and all that sort of thing. They couldn't possibly have done that while they were traveling. And then they had the time to review the report as they flew back to Washington, usually a 8-hour, 45-minute trip in those days in one of the Air Force One aircraft. And they left Andrews Field in a helicopter. They arrived on the White House lawn and presented it to the president. It had just left him about 2 days earlier. And here was the trip report. That's October 2nd of 1963. And that trip report contains the information that Kennedy had approved, that he was going to bring 1,000 men home by Christmas time. That's 1,000 military men. And by the end of 65, the bulk of U.S. personnel. Now, bureaucracy is an interesting thing. We learn what certain words mean. If he had said he would bring home the bulk of American military personnel, you would assume that the military personnel were there. So he'd bring them in. And most people who write about that period say Kennedy was going to bring home or not bring home. He was going to. They used the word they were going to withdraw the soldiers. Well, they weren't going to withdraw them. They weren't there. Withdraw is not the word. That's wrong. And many people have been writing for The Nation magazine and other magazines like that, trying to explain Kennedy's mind, overlooked the fact that we very carefully inserted into that document, bring home the U.S. personnel. And what did that mean? The CIA people were coming on. So again, that lowered the boom on the CIA, and this time it was the last time. They were going to be out of covert operation completely. So NSAM 55 began the movement of getting CIA out, and 263 closed the book on it, and by 65 he would have had no CIA people in Vietnam at all, and they'd been there since 45. So you see that a good long period of time, 20 years. And in other countries too, he would have stopped them from being in covert operations overseas. It's very fundamental points that if you look in the right books and at the right reports, you get them all, and they're all backed up. These are not my words. I happen to be there, and I happen to be working in them. But this series, especially this latest book that has just been released, gives you the answers to what people have been looking for years. But the trouble is that during this period, countless history books have been written about Kennedy, about Vietnam, about the post-war period, about the Cold War. And the writers have not used this sort of material. And unfortunately, the books are, what would we call them, fantasy or mythology?
Concoction.
Correct. I belong to the Society of Historians for American Foreign Relations, a wonderful organization of thousands of mostly history professors all throughout the country. And as we have our annual meetings, one of the complaints that arises more frequently than any other is the quality of history books today. Quality meaning, are they true? Are they revisionist? There's more things been written about Kennedy that are absolutely untrue since his death. There's no sense of killing a guy twice, once with a gun and once with a typewriter. And they're untrue. And what I think people ought to do is refer to the work of these generals, like this report at the Bay of Pigs, or refer to these papers from the State Department. They're listed as the Foreign Relations of the United States, and see what the facts are. Or refer to some of the gentlemen that are mentioned in here who are still with us, God bless them, because those are the important things. And that tells us what really happened. And this is why when I worked with Oliver Stone, we were working from this kind of paper, and that's what stirred up so much opposition. Yeah. Because when these big-time writers in the New York Times and the Washington Post and other papers said, there is no substantive history to back up what Stone's putting in the film, all they do is read these books. There's the substantive history. And it's appalling to think that these men who work every day on the minds of the American public with their computer writing through the New York Times and the Washington Post and the rest of them are telling us that sort of thing when they know very well what they're saying is not true. It's too bad, but it's not true.
And as you were saying before, the Taylor-McNamara report, which became, in essence, the formalized text for 263, you were involved working under Krulak in writing a lot of what became their report that they gave back to Kennedy when they arrived on the White House lawn, that was derived from all these meetings.
Yes. And you know, people have to understand, when you talk about the Joint Chiefs of Staff, there's an organization called the Joint Staff. Now, in my day, by law, it could not exceed 400 people. And so I was one of 400. And people say, well, what's your job? Our job is to do this kind of thing. When General Krulak would come back, he'd throw notes on the table before 5 or 6 of us, or even tape record, cassette recording. And he'd say, there's what we did today. Now look, each one of you do such and such a part you've been working on, and we'll get this report the way the President wants it. Right. And when it was the way the President wanted it, that's when it went out to Hawaii to Taylor and McNamara, so that when it came back, the President was ready to sign it as his policy for Vietnam, which was he was not going to put American troops into Vietnam. Where we put, do you know how many troops were really in Vietnam? 2,600,000. And 58,000 were killed, let alone all the other people that were killed.
By the time it was all done?
By the time the Vietnam War was over, 2,600,000 men had been rotated through Vietnam. We don't very often think about that. We dropped more bombs from aircraft in Vietnam, in Indochina, than all of World War II. People don't have any idea what Vietnam really got to be after the death of Kennedy. Well, in all of those big numbers that I'm talking about, the money that rolled out went at least to $570 billion. Now, if Kennedy had not died, he would not have put those people there. Not just the 500,000 that were there at any one given day, but the 2,600,000. And if the people didn't go, they would not have had to spend the $570 billion. Well, there were, as General Eisenhower said in his great speech, which was the opening of the Stone film,
great,
that beware of the military-industrial complex. And when you threaten such a complex with the potential of 570 billion, and then you're going to bring it down to nothing, you are bound to get some hot-headed decisions. and the removal of the president is not a very difficult thing to do. Just think of the list of presidents who've been wounded, shot at, killed since World War II. A lot of people don't know that even President Carter was threatened with assassination. And President Reagan had a bullet in him. It's a very, very different world when we don't use things in a factual basis and really know what's going on, because then the public is so badly confused. Plus in debt. Confused and deeply in debt. You know, I don't have, my book is here. I don't know whether I can, but in the book I could show you, just to make a point, because I knew the document, I inserted in this book of mine the picture of these men coming back to Washington with this report. It's on the coffee table in the president's office. And if anybody thinks that that huge report could have been written while they were running from one place to another in Vietnam, you see that big report on the coffee table in front of the president and Maxwell Taylor and McNamara there? That is the report of the trip. They couldn't have done that on the back of envelopes while they were running.
Right.
And it was very carefully designed by Kennedy to support his Vietnam policy, you see. He had no, it's like saying he was to blame for not providing air cover for the Cubans. Here's something people are saying he had no polish for Vietnam. He was going to do. The thing that's very interesting about Kennedy's death and this work, there was a meeting convened in Honolulu on the 20th of November, 1963. Very strange meeting, because 60 leaders of our government, including the ambassador from Saigon, among others, and all of Kennedy's cabinet had gone to Honolulu. And they had this meeting about what to do in the future with the Vietnam War. Despite the fact that this existed, there was this meeting about the Vietnam War. The interesting thing is that the report that they released that day, November 20th, and published in the New York Times, among other papers, on the 21st, is a glowing report of how things were becoming better in Vietnam. And yet, on the same day, November 21st, 1963, a report was written called NSAM 273, which was reversing some of the Kennedy policy for Vietnam. And yet, hypothetically, this NSAM, new NSAM, would have to be signed by Kennedy. And yet the Honolulu meeting was providing Kennedy with assurances that everything was going well. So could it be that this NSAM 273 was somehow signaling a change, which of course by March of 1973, when NSAM 288 came out under Lyndon Johnson, escalated the war to what we saw later.
Now you said March of 83. You mean March of 64?
No, March of 64.
March
yes,
of 64.
Thank you very much. Okay. March of 64. But you can see the changes in it. And some of these people have said, again referring to the Kennedy policy of not putting not withdrawing America, but not putting Americans in. Withdrawal was bringing the boys home for Christmas. But not putting them in, they completely overlooked this rapid change that came right about the time the president was killed. And to me, it just underscores terrifically the way history books are worked on.
Right.
In 1967, sort of summing up all of this Vietnam period, Secretary McNamara of the Defense Department ordered a group to write the history of the U.S. in Vietnam from 1945, notice the date he picks, 45, to the present. and the present would be when they got it done, the end of 1968. So, rather in a chronological manner, they wrote what amount to being 5 volumes this size of this history of the United States, a history written by people in the Pentagon, paid for by the U.S. government, and published by the U.S. government. It's called the Pentagon Papers. Because it is the same stack of highly classified papers that Daniel Ellsberg released to the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and a few other papers. And of course, Ellsberg got in serious trouble for violating security and releasing this, which of course was very good advertising for this, because this was put together, as it states clearly in the opening paragraphs, by a man named Les Gelb. Gelb was working in the internal security agency offices of the Office of the Secretary of Defense.
Okay.
That's where he was working. It also just happens that if you look in the Pentagon telephone books of the period, you find that not only is Mr. Gelb listed in ISA, but Daniel Ellsberg is listed in the Pentagon telephone books. And anybody that has enough interest to want to read history should just look in these books, because a lot of other nice names in here. General Richard Secord was working in the same office. Mr. Eagleberger, the State Department, was working in the same office.
ISA.
ISA. Bill Bundy was working. Bill Bundy was the head of it for a while, ISA. They had a little robin's nest there that was bringing out all these things. But something that I want to emphasize on this business of history, because most history professors, and therefore, unfortunately, most history students, believe that the Pentagon Papers are the essence of the Vietnam War period, and that if they study these, they know what went on. And the book is written in chronology. Like the page I'm open to here has the 3rd of November, the 4th of November, and over here on this page, 9th of November, the 20th of November, the Honolulu Conference, the conference I was talking to you about, with all the people out there. The entire country team met with Rusk, McNamara, Taylor, Bundy, Bell. So I have a copy of a letter Bundy wrote in 1991. This is McGeorge Bundy, saying he wasn't there. Here he listed. Maybe the history book's wrong. But it's real interesting. They right up to the 20th. Then on the 22nd of November, 1963, on a blank slate in the Pentagon, they wrote this: Lodge confers with the President. 22nd of November. Having flown to Washington the day after the conference, Lodge meets with the President and presumably continues the kind of report given in Honolulu. 23 November 1963, NSAM 273. Drawing together the results of the Honolulu Conference and Lodge's meeting with the President, NSAM 273 reaffirms the U.S. commitment to defeat the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. But what's missing? The men that wrote this wrote it in 1968. They hadn't heard that Kennedy had died. They didn't even know Kennedy was missing. When Lodge confers with the President, they didn't clarify whether he met with Kennedy or Johnson, or neither. Right. This is how history is written today. You see? And such things as that are very powerful in the minds of people in college today who are too young to know the things that I can remember about General Walter Beadle Smith, or General Ridgway, or General Bradley, or Allen Dulles. I've worked in Allen Dulles' home with him. I know what Allen Dulles thinks about various things. I've worked with him in John Foster Dulles' home. Well, why can't we tell it the way it is? Why can't we tell it truthfully? So on the 22nd of November, according to this 5-volume study done by 36 PhDs working with Les Gelb, who has been the managing editor of the New York Times, among other things, on the 22nd of November, they didn't even notice that the President of the United States had been shot. And the rest of our history books are just about that good. It's terrible. It's a disaster.
Now remember that little important part right there at the end. The next time you go to debate somebody about this and they think that, they're a college professor or they took 4 years of college or they have a degree in something and you didn't go to college. Maybe you went to trade school. Maybe you just didn't go to college because you couldn't afford it. Maybe you're a self-educated individual like myself. I couldn't afford to go to college. Yet I come up here and I talk to you all and give you all information every night, right? You all ask me questions. A lot of you seek out truth. You come to me and say, hey, Popeye, you seem to be a knowledgeable guy about certain things. I didn't get that from a college education. I got that from educating myself, being an autodidact. Well, next time you get into a conversation with somebody and they put you down for being an autodidact, or they put you down because they've read history books so they know, and what you know can't possibly be right, or else the historians would talk about it, and much brighter people than you have looked into it. Remember what Colonel Prouty was just saying. Those people don't have a clue. They don't know. They're well-versed in fiction. They're well-versed in what they've been spoon-fed. But that doesn't mean they're well-versed in reality. And by the way, it doesn't make you well-adjusted to be able to regurgitate what you've been spoon-fed and programmed. And clap like a seal waiting for your fish. When I was a kid, it was a gold star, on your homework, and they would give you a piece of candy or something when you were younger. Then when you got older, maybe it was a positive grade, or sometimes they would give out, awards for kids with the best grades every month. Now they don't do that because they can't be unfair to children. You can't be unfair. Everybody has to be equal. Right, that's really good, because that instills no competitiveness whatsoever into the child. And then when they get older, they just expect everything to be equal and fair, and that's not how life really is, and then they're not going to be well adjusted anyway. I digress. So, what you heard tonight, the information that Colonel Prouty presented to you tonight, is all factual. It's also all available for you to read in his 2 books, JFK and The Secret Team. Go over to blackopradio.com. blackopradio.com. My good friend Leno Senek, that's his website. He's got a ton of radio archives. He's another radio show host. But he's got both of Prouty's books in his, I think it's products section, or whatever it is. You'll see it up there. I think it says products. If you click on it, he's got not only his archives and stuff, but he's got Prouty's 2 books, which you could purchase, I think, directly from him, or you can go to Amazon and get them right from Amazon. Again, JFK and The Secret Team. But if you go to prouty.org, prouty.org, that is the Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty archive website. Everything you could ever want to know about Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, a.k.a. Mr. X in Oliver Stone's JFK. That character is heavily based on Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. Go get his books. Get all the downloads from Len's site. Rip it. Everything you can get, you can buy. There's like a whole package you can buy. It's like $150 or something. And it's got every interview he's ever done and a ton of other stuff on there. And it's a ton of DVDs and a bunch of other information. This is stuff that I promise you is worth the money. Without a shadow of a doubt, it's worth every penny you could possibly spend on it, ladies and gentlemen. Every red cent you could possibly spend. You're going to spend $150 on somebody for Christmas, right? So maybe they like military history or whatnot. Instead of spending $150 on books that are fictional crap for them, go over and buy the Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty archive. That would be pretty cool, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. Just want to say thank you all for tuning in. Do not think that because this happened 50 years ago, it is not important to this very day. Because it is more important than you could ever possibly imagine. It set the tone for what we live in today. So don't stop speaking about this. Ever. speak truth to power forever and ever. Ladies and gentlemen, I love you all. I'll catch you all again tomorrow night. I'm out.